Okay, so now let's talk about some of these changes in Huli economics and culture that have been brought about by globalization and Papua New Guinea and Huli people, Huli being the ethnic group, one particular ethnic group from Papua New Guinea, how they've been brought into the global market and the way that that is affecting their sexuality, not just the way they feel love, the type of love they're able to experience, as we've been talking about with Koreans, but how they actually have sex and the type of sex that they want from which kinds of people. That is their sexuality. So there's been a lot of economic decline in Papua New Guinea as people have turned away from farming and become reliant on global capital as money is a medium and wage labor as a medium to buy the things, the necessities that they need. It's increasingly difficult for young people to get married because of this, because of these sort of, I hate to use the word inflation because we're dealing with so much inflation right now in the United States, but the increase in price of for bride prices and the decreasing wages that men are able to earn, and not only that men are earning lower wages, but it forces men to travel for work, often to this place called, I'm gonna not pronounce this very well, but Porgera, I'm guessing, is a gold mine, and they're working under the table. They're working illegally. This really dangerous, dirty work, and they have to travel away from their wives, and so they aren't even seeing their wives. So. Not only are men forced in this global capitalist market to move around, as we all are, but women are forced to do this as well. So there's an increasing number of women and visibility of exchanging sex for money, and it's incredibly inexpensive for these men. So there's a increased temptation, increased not need. Need is not the right word, but increasing availability, and they're away from their wives. So I don't know how increasing risk for men to be tempted to engage in these transactions for sex. Whereas in traditional Papua New Guinean culture, Huli culture, men would never really even come into contact with women that they were not genetically related to or who were not their wives in public. And so this is just changing very, very rapidly. So, traditional Huli marital sex, you've read a lot about this in your book. I'm not going to waste your time by going through every one of these things in great detail, but spouses typically would only have sex on days 11 to 14 of the wife's menstrual cycle. This was to protect the male body from being overly influenced or overly infected by femininity, as we've talked about in Huli sexual system. Having sex with lots or gender system, having sex with women too often will cause you to become feminine, whereas in the American system, having sex very often with lots of women will increase your masculinity. Same behavior, opposite effect. It's interesting. So husbands never had to worry about if a wife was in the mood. It was just assumed that she was in the mood from the 11th to the 14th. Christian missionaries taught that marital sex was strictly for reproduction, and this aligned up pretty well with traditional Huli customs. So that sex should be managed in terms of timing, venue, bodily technique. We talk about in the United States the missionary position. Well, that is where this term comes from. Missionaries, like traditional sexual educators in Huli society, taught that there was just only face-to-face copulation with the man on top, and men are always supposed to be both physically on top in Huli culture, but also sort of symbolically on top, so that carried over to their sexuality. And so a lot of Christian missionary teachings were lining up with traditional sexual mores among the Huli. Um, Partners should minimize bodily contact during sex. So oftentimes very traditional Huli men would remain partially clothed, or their partner would remain partly clothed during sex, or they would hold themselves up so that just their kind of genitals were touching during sex and the rest of their body was not coming into contact. But of course, modern Huli marital sex is changing. Some men, this is going to be a little bit of a side, but as I was reading this, some men seem to be deeply romantically in love with their wives. And it turns out that those men were more likely to cast off the traditional marital sex, and they were more likely to find their own path, as they would say, and do their own sexual practices and do style sex with their partners. But more often than not, Huli men felt very uncomfortable asking their wives for style sex, for letting their wives know that they enjoyed sex at all, because they didn't want their wives to become too powerful, because there's this sexual tension, not sexual tension, but tension between the two genders over dominance, and they didn't want their wives to have like a sort of trump card over them. So some men deliberately adopted modern sexual practices to lend legitimate intimacy to their already emotional, distant behaviors with their wives. Men who were in love with their wives, often their first wife, did not follow traditional sexual patterns. However, men were more likely to follow traditional sexual practices with their second wives, or when an arranged marriage took place. So when they just had a companionate marriage, companionate love with their wife, they were more likely to follow these sort of traditional sexual practices with them, in order to, so that other people in their group would not find out that they enjoyed sex, so that they could maintain a traditional domination over that person. Innovative sexual practices were associated with literacy, education, access to foreign films, particularly Nigerian pornographic films, urban life, modern housing, emotional intimacy, and especially progress. Now, some men desired this. Some men really desire this, even though they might have a traditional arranged marriage, or sort of a normal, standard traditional marriage back in their home village, particularly men that were forced to travel to other places for diamond mining, gold mining, etc. They would engage in these extramarital relationships, which for them was sort of a necessity. They didn't necessarily want to, but they were far away, and they had a little extra money, and it was something that they saw as being very transactional and not necessarily risking their marriage, right? So one person said, "You can have fun, relaxed conversation with a girlfriend or sex worker, but not with your wife. If you do, she'll use that information to dominate you." And you can ask yourself, why? Why was that? Huli men do not verbally express their sexual desires with their wives because it indicates, as I've said before, a preoccupation with sex, so it shows a lack of discipline, making you weak or untrustworthy, and suggests an inordinate attachment to or desire with your wife. That's really interesting. I don't know about how we think about that, but I'm not sure if modern American men think that asking their girlfriend or their wife for a specific sexual act or position would make them seem weak. In fact, it might make them seem sort of, I don't know, have what do you call it? I'll have to cut this out because I'm forgetting my words again. Might make you seem confident. That's the word. It might seem, oh, you're confident enough to ask me for what you want. That's good, you know. So yeah, that's pretty interesting to me. Huli extramarital sexuality continued. So, if men were concerned about health, fertility, and social efficacy in marriage, why were they so quick to engage in extramarital sex? Well, every single thing that they do with their wives, whether there's so many options open to Huli men, they can't really just follow tradition anymore because the world around them is changing so rapidly. There's influence from missionaries, influence from globalization. Everything they do with their wives sexually, if they choose to live in the same house with their wives, if they choose to have sex with them, style sex or traditional sex, if they are romantically in love with them or just not romantic, companionate marriage. Each choice is a moral statement about the kind of man he is, and each choice has potential unforeseeable implications for the future health and stability of his marital and reproductive life. Now, in contrast, many Huli men describe commercial sex as a gendered transaction that was transparent, inconsequential, and less emotionally fraught than marriage. It was also appealing because of its association with modernity, autonomy, and urban kind of masculinity, right? And so there's all sorts of reasons why people are sort of looking to extramarital sex, not just because they are traveling and it's convenient, but because it actually offers them something, a relaxed sort of sexual relationship that they can't have with their wives because their sexual relationships with their wives are so fraught and dangerous, right? So most men first exchange sex for money after labor migration. They consider it harmless, inconsequential escape from emotional hardship and family separation, and it expresses their modern, autonomous, worldly masculinity. Men could experiment with innovative sexual practices with passenger women more easily than with their wives, and passenger women were free from this sort of sexual pollution. Yeah, I just found this chapter really, really interesting. We've talked a lot about the globalization of a certain kind of through film and media, American romance, and now we're starting to talk too about American sexuality impacting other places. But just as we our previous film worried that our certain sexuality was going to go around the world and we were going to all have the same exact sexuality because of popular culture. This example is a little bit more like the McDonald's example, where, well, no, that's not how it works. Traditional sexuality actually gets all mixed up and creates new sexual systems that have never existed before. This looks a lot more like diffusion and globalization and globalization than it does cultural homogeneity. So that's what I liked about this book, or excuse me, this chapter. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.